interconnections between policies to move towards universal health coverage as a key element of social protection, and policies to advance gender equality, women's empowerment, and human rights have seen advances in recent years, especially since 2010. These advances have occurred against the backdrop of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Despite difficult economic circumstances, rising inequality, constrained political space, and continuing and new forms of political backlash and resistance. Social mobilizing and advocacy have opened policy space for global agreements, such as ILO Recommendation Number 202 in 2012 and Target 1.3 of the SDGs, which recognize the potential of national social protection floors as tools against poverty and vulnerability. Recognition of universal health coverage, or UHC as it is known, as central to social protection has been relatively recent. It was consolidated with the passing of the Social Protection Floors recommendation at the ILO in 2002 by the International Labour Conference in 2012. This recommendation guides ILO member states on how to build comprehensive social security systems, starting with national social protection floors. The recommendation calls for applying the principle of non-discrimination, gender equality, and responsiveness to special needs. Building on Articles 22 and 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ILO Recommendation Number 202 includes UHC as one of 4 minimum elements for a social protection floor. Quote, access to a nationally defined set of goods and services constituting essential health care, including maternity care, that meets the criteria of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. But recognition of UHC as one of the key elements of an SPF, social protection floor, needs to be matched both by adequate financing and by ensuring access to all women and girls, as well as groups who are vulnerable to exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination on grounds, among others, of poverty, ethnicity, race, caste, age, sexual orientation and gender identity, disability, indigeneity, migrant or refugee status, and location. The length of that list, and that is not all, tells us about the kind of world we live in, where more and more groups face discrimination and exclusion. So my first point is that synergies matter. In the case of UHC, its recognition as a key element of social protection will have stronger impact when combined with access for all to needed public services and to infrastructure that supports such access and is sustainable through adequate budgets and spending. Second, gender equality matters. Gender equality can be the catalyst for the realization of synergies by ensuring access and sustainability. And women and girls' human rights matter. A grounding in the human rights of girls and women, including their sexual and reproductive health and rights, not only puts the spotlight on their needs and rights, it identifies duty bearers in states and governance systems. It foregrounds their own voices and agency. It makes real the slogan of social mobilizing, nothing about us without us. Much of the debate around social protection, including UHC, has focused on the relative merits of program instruments such as targeting and conditionalities, where human rights don't necessarily have pride of place. Human rights tend instead, in such approaches, to be excluded and are evaluated, if at all, on par at the same level with efficiency, effectiveness, and other criteria. But a recent useful UNDP primer argues that social protection ensures access, stimulates productive inclusion through the development of capabilities, skills, and rights, and opportunities for the poor and excluded, builds resilience and protects people against the risks of livelihood shocks throughout their life cycle, and helps remove structural barriers, including barriers within the household that prevent people from achieving well-being. So what are these barriers? From the perspective of UHC, a simple demand-side versus supply-side distinction can help to clarify both the nature of the barriers and the nature of the synergies that are possible. On the supply side, the provision of infrastructure, available, accessible, affordable primary health centers, emergency transportation, reliable referral systems, as well as basics such as clean water, toilets, medical waste disposal, etc., are well known. But these have to be matched by other key elements on the supply side, such as adequate staffing and equipment and quality of care in services. But these supply-side elements may elude women and girls unless they are provided with an eye to tackling the risk of exclusion and discrimination. Infrastructure may be unfriendly to disabled people. Services may stigmatize poor women, pregnant adolescents, ethnic caste minorities, LGBTI groups, and others. Disrespect and abuse in service provision, especially but not only in obstetric care, can violate women's dignity and humanity, driving them away from public services, as has been widely documented in many countries. Women and babies held captive until they pay fees or bribes has been noted in multiple contexts. And while abortion is actually legal in most countries of the world, stigma and harassment of abortion seekers violate their human rights and drive them into unsafe services, despite the fact that abortion is one of the simplest and safest of procedures when properly conducted. HIV-positive girls, LGBTI people, and sex workers face fear, discrimination, violence, and even death when seeking health services. On the demand side, too, many bottlenecks stand between women and access to health services. Poverty and inequality are not only economically driven, but also by exclusion or marginalization due to other sources of deprivation. Such deprivation involves the interpenetrating workings of multiple relations of power, oppression, and disadvantage. It is this conjoint working of different social forces that is often the most challenging barrier to policy interventions. Such deep poverty is intersectional. Its victims suffer multiple and reinforcing forms of oppression, some of which, like gender, caste, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, may be long-standing and deeply embedded in social systems and structures of belief and practice. What is more, because such intersecting and enmeshed power relations and oppression can be difficult to tackle, program implementers may tend to direct their attention to groups higher up the ladder just because they have fewer barriers to transcend. An intersectional approach can help us understand why, even if the programs in themselves are delivered well, sustained programmatic attention to the health of those suffering from economic poverty alone may not yield the desired outcomes without more nuanced and multidimensional approaches that are sensitive to the intersections of deep poverty. For instance, a conditional cash transfer requiring poor women to bring their children for immunization may be ineffective for women suffering from deep poverty whose caste, ethnic, or indigenous background may mean that they fear disrespect or mistreatment in the health center, or who live in hamlets that are ill-served by public transport, or who do not have help to care for other children, older or sick or disabled people at home. The result can be weak program outcomes because such intersections have not been adequately addressed. Such discrimination against women and girls is reinforced by their weak access to and control over financial resources, weak social networks, and lack of knowledge and information about health and other services. Their time poverty is exacerbated by their highly unequal work burdens and responsibilities for the unpaid care of children, the old, and the infirm. Interpersonal violence and fear of domestic and public violence can keep them away from public spaces, including schools and health centers, and this may be increasingly so in a growing atmosphere of religion or race or migration or caste and other forms of publicly sanctioned hatred. One of the most chilling findings in the 2017 report on adolescence of the Independent Accountability Panel for the SG's Every Woman, Every Child, Every Adolescent, that panel of which I am now a member, was the extent to which in country after country, boys aged 15 to 19 believed that violence against adolescent girls and women on trivial grounds was justified. Over 40%, sometimes over 60% of boys aged 15 to 19, which means that something seriously is going wrong in the way in which not just we are bringing up girl children, but we are bringing up boy children as well. In conclusion, synergies between the financing and provision of health services and infrastructure on the one side, and access that transcends both supply and demand-side barriers are possible, but they will only be realized if the human rights, including the voice and agency of girls and women, are recognized and realized. I thank you, Madam Chair.